Hello, brothers and sisters. We're continuing. Let me get my reading list here. Continuing in Romans 11 through 13. So we're finishing this section about the sovereignty of God in salvation, and then moving into a section about service, verses 12 through the end of the book. We're coming to the end of verse 11, or chapter 11 here. We are in chapter 11. Chapter 9 was about election. We've talked about that. Chapter 10 is about rejection. Chapter 11 is about restoration. That's how we can divide this up. Paul first begins chapter 11 in the first 10 verses by talking about the extent of Israel's rejection, how far that rejection has gone, how many are rejected. And then he makes the point, starting in verse 11 of chapter 11 and going through verse 16, that their rejection is not permanent. It's not beyond recovery. That Israel is not only not beyond recovery, but they will be recovered. We'll see in a moment here. Verses 17 through 24, then Paul makes the additional point that not only are they not beyond recovery, but they can't be replaced. That they can't be replaced in God's plans or purposes. This is the famous section about the olive branches and grafting them in and cutting them off. I think the main point here, we could get into a more detailed teaching easily here, but the main point is that they are not able to be replaced. That yes, there's a grafted in branch, but the original branch will be restored. And that's the topic of verses 25 through 23. Love 25, makes it very clear. It says, lest you be wise in your own sight. So don't be too wise, don't be too proud, don't think you know it all. Lest you be wise in your own sight. I do want you to know, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. What's a mystery? Well, mystery, we have murder mysteries on TV, and they're kind of hard to understand. That's not what a mystery is in the Bible, though. A mystery in the Bible is not something that's hard to understand, but a mystery is something that hasn't been revealed. It's a mystery until it's been revealed. So I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, of this mystery. Paul's about to clue us in here. He says, a partial hardening has come upon Israel. Well, he says partial hardening. Why? Because there are some Israelites who believe. There are Jewish believers today. Paul himself was among the first of the Jewish believers. I guess we could say the apostles were. But in the church age, Paul was one of the first, the earliest. And so he is among that remnant that God has kept. It's only a partial hardening. And that partial hardening is going to continue for some period of time. How long? Well, Paul uses this time word, until, in verse 25. Until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. So what Paul is saying here is that there's today a remnant of Jews are being saved, but there's a day coming, and that day is coming after all the Gentiles that God has determined, God has elected, after they are all saved. Then the partial hardening of Israel will be taken away, and in this way all Israel will be saved. So Paul is assuring us here that there is going to be a restoration of Israel. And then in verses 30 to 32, he celebrates God's mercy. And in the rest of the chapter, he just glorifies God's majesty. Oh, this is mind-blowing. That's why it's hard to understand, or hard to believe. It's not hard to understand. It's pretty straightforward, really, when you follow Paul through here. It's just hard to believe. Now, building on this and going on, Paul then turns back to the next section. He turns to service. Remember, we've had a section on sin, chapters 1 through 3. section on salvation, chapters 3 through 5, section on sanctification, chapters 6 through 8, a section on God's sovereignty in salvation, chapters 9 through 11, which we just finished, and now we're about to start the fifth and final division of the book, service. Service answers the question, now that I've been saved, now that righteousness has been credited to my account, how am I to live? What should I do? How do I respond to that? Paul's already said that we've got the Spirit indwelling us, the Spirit securing us, the Spirit enabling us. So what should we do? So Paul begins by an appeal in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, to be different. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers. So he's talking to the whole church. He's talking to the whole group that's reading this letter in Rome, the whole church in Rome. Wants the whole church sanctified. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what is good and acceptable and perfect. So he starts out with this appeal to humility to ourselves, to this group in this local church. And then how does that humility work itself out? That's in verses 3 through 8. It says, for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, do not think of himself more highly than he ought. So he appeals to us to humble ourselves, to offer ourselves as a humble sacrifice before the Lord. And then he says, work out this humility then, work out this dedication of yourselves by being humble in the local church. In verses 3 through 8, he appeals to that. He appeals to unity. He appeals through humility. And then shifting in in chapter 12, starts a new paragraph in verse 9 about love. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. And he begins with some general admonitions about love in the verses 9 through 13. And then he talks about love with regard to unbelievers in 14 and 16. And then love extended to believers, brothers and sisters, in 17 through 21. Notice the argument he's making here, right? That we begin with a personal humility. We begin by giving ourselves over completely to God, humbling ourselves before Him. And then we practice that in the local church. Love is an outgrowth of that, and we extend love to society at large, both to people in general and then to believers. Paul goes on here, you check where I'm at, to chapter 13. Paul goes on here in chapter 13 then, and he says, okay, how do you live out this holiness and righteousness that's been imputed to you, that's been credited to your account? That's how you do it with regard to society. Society in the church, society outside the church. Now here's how you do it with government. And that's what chapter 13 is talking about. He says unequivocally that believers are to be subject to the governing authorities. That submission has a divine origin, that there is no governing authority that God has not put in place. There's a divine purpose for that, to maintain peace and security. Remember, Paul is writing in this time of Pax Romana, and he's recognizing that the purpose of government and God's ordained purpose of government is to keep peace. And in verses 5 through 7, he identifies it not as an option, but this is a divine necessity. We must do this. Now, frequently, Bible teachers would then start listing the exceptions. And my tendency, if we had more time, would be to do just that. But brothers and sisters, let us not escape, let not the fact escape us that Paul is calling us here to submission to governing authorities. There may be exceptions to that, but that's not the rule. The rule is that we submit ourselves to governing authorities. I know the emails are going to be flying my way soon. I'm just trying to explain as best I can what I think the Bible says here. Verses 8 through 10 then speak about how to relate to one another in this governmental context, and that is through love. Love one another, don't owe anything to anyone except to love each other, for the one who loves one another has fulfilled the law. What a simple way to summarize the relationships that we're to have, is to love one another. And finally, in verses 11 through 14, he closes with this sense of expectation. Verses 11 and 12. Besides this, in other words, here's another reason for you to submit, because God put those governing authorities in place, because you are to be loving one another. But besides this, one more reason, the time, the hour has come for you to wake from your sleep, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. He's talking about the return of Jesus here. That return of Jesus, that consummation of salvation is near at hand. So we need to quit goofing around, right? We need to quit fooling around. We need to take what God has said seriously, what Jesus has taught. We need to quit playing at our piety, but we need to give ourselves over to it and pursue the things that God has for us. In verses 12, he begins the end of verse 12. We have this requirement, this duty to put on the armor of light and let us walk properly, that is, in accordance with the expectations that God has, in daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy. Well, I'm confident, brothers and sisters, and all of you, that we're not dealing with drunkenness, sexual immorality, sensuality, or orgies. I'll go out on a limb and say that, although I know some of you have struggled with unfaithfulness. Nevertheless, what he's saying here is it's time to put all that aside. Let's do our duty, do what's right, and walk as the Lord intends us to walk. Let's close there. I don't think I need to make any spiritual applications to this. It's pretty straightforward, I think, at this point, that Paul wants us to offer ourselves to God, offer ourselves to each other, offer ourselves to the government in humility, in love, out of a sense of duty, knowing that the time is short. So let's be done with sin. Let's be done with fooling around. Let's be done with half measures. And let's give ourselves fully to what God has called us to do in these verses. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Enjoy your reading as you finish up the book of Romans.